Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for waiting a few extra minutes. This is Ask a Parliamentarian. Oh, okay. One other question for you though. Do you also see my my Ask a Parliamentarian chat on your screen, or do you just see the All About Bylaws revision? I guess I should say, do you see my little chat box that I'm moving around?
I do not see the chat box.
Okay, Monty, thank you. Okay, I've done this. This is my 11th session, but I'm still learning. And so I ask for your patience while I continue to improve my technical skills on this. So I am super happy to have you guys here. Oh, Susan, you see, okay, you see it, good. Let's go ahead and move on. Sure. Just wanted to share with you.
You can designate a specific window.
I just did, thank you. Appreciate it. You know what? That's not working for me right now. Sorry, sweetie. It's all right. Okay. Okay, we're going to get started. I do want to introduce myself briefly. My name is Wendy Bagley. I am a member of National Association of Parliamentarians. And as of today, I found out, so hurrah, hurrah, that I am a registered parliamentarian, which is an official credential of the National Association of Parliamentarians. It took quite a little over a year for me to practice and study for it, and 2 times testing, I finally made it. So it doesn't mean that I am perfect with parliamentary procedure, but it does mean that I have learned enough and have been found to have a sufficient amount of knowledge and skill to have earned that credential. So if I do say anything though that is wrong, please by all means ask me and let me know, because it will be an opportunity for me to learn and to correct myself and be better for the future. So my mission, I'm the owner of Right Choice Consulting and Management, and my mission is to empower as many people as I can to find their voices using parliamentary procedure, the principles, the tried and true principles, and then with those skills be able to make a difference in their communities. So that everything that I do with my parliamentary procedure is trying to help people find their voice and share it. So here we go. My lessons focus primarily on Robert's Rules of Order, 12th edition. It's the Robert's Rules of Order newly revised, as well as the Robert's Rules of Order newly revised in brief. So both the white version and the yellow version. When I started with parliamentary procedure, the cover I think was burgundy, and it was the 10th edition. So it's gone through quite a few revisions since then. But this particular one, the way we abbreviate and cite it is RONR, 12th edition. And so when you see that on my slides, that you'll know that's the book I'm referring to. This and that's the RONR, let me grab it, is the really huge one, kind of the dictionary kind, that the parliamentarians learn and get to navigate really, really well. As far as the majority of people, what I recommend, highly recommend, is this book, Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised in brief. It's the only authorized, concise guide of Robert's Rules. And this is, if you've seen some of my other lessons, you know that Robert's Rules of Order has been around for over 100 years. And there are many groups that have Robert's Rules of Order, or they use the words, but they're not the official one that has been carried down in Robert's generations for, you know, on and has been in the family and revised and is authorized. So this particular one in brief has, within about 30 minutes, you can get a really quick overview. Within about 90 minutes, you can have a really good, just basic understanding of Robert's Rules. And it will tell you exactly, you know, if you've got half an hour, read these chapters. If you've got, you know, 60 minutes, read these chapters. If you've got 90 minutes, read these. So I strongly recommend this book for beginners. When I'm referring to Robert's Rules of Order in brief, it's the RONRIB. Okay, moving on. So every single, Okay, I did make the announcement for being a parliamentarian. Sherry, do you remember, was there one other announcement? I can't remember.
No, I don't remember. You didn't tell me that. Sorry.
You know what? That's a-okay. If it's important, we'll come back to me. Usually I do try to do like an announcements page, but that's all right. Okay, the mini lesson. Usually I try to focus on a mini lesson for every single Ask a Parliamentarian series. Because we're doing a special one on bylaws, it comes down to 2 questions. And so these 2 questions are going to be, what is a bylaw? And then how are they amended? So this first section is going to go over what is a bylaw. Let me pull it up on my other computer here so I can follow along. Okay. So also, just for what it's worth, I will keep my eyes on the chat box. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. Hopefully I should see it in my side gallery. But feel free, if I'm not hearing you or seeing your comment or your question, feel free to just interrupt me, and that's it. That's a-okay with this. So, okay. Okay, so the bylaws, as most of you are familiar, if you know, have seen or worked with bylaws before, the bylaws contain the group's own basic rules relating to its own organization. Very often it will follow, a lot of bylaws will follow the same pattern. You've got the name, you've got the object or the purpose of the organization. You have a section talking about who are the members and how do they gain membership. Talks about the officers, how are they elected, meetings, and so on and so forth. And there is a really good section, actually several sections in Robert's Rules that actually explain the principles of bylaws and then goes through section by section and gives you sample wording for and why that wording should be in your bylaws. So that is something that parliamentarians do, is help people understand their bylaws and try to help make them stronger and better for the purposes of that meeting. And so it's important, the next section is going to help you see particularly where bylaws fit in overall to the rules that govern an assembly. As you see here, the very first level, Robert's Rules is really awesome. One of the primary, like, basic principles of Robert's Rules is that we are a society that lives according to the rule of law. Instead of just one group arbitrarily getting power and saying, we want to do this, the group comes together as individual sovereigns and choose together to associate and say, we are going to live according to laws that we all agree upon. And that's how we're going to govern our assembly. That is the rule of law. And so with this rule of law, there's different levels or different types of laws or types of rules. And that's what we're going to cover now. So the very first, like the highest authority of law comes from statutory law. In other words, laws, statutes, ordinances, maybe at the federal level or the state level or at a local municipal level. Some examples are, for the United States, of course, we have the United States Constitution, we have the First Amendment, right of assembly, right of free speech. We have the right as citizens of the United States to join together and to create associations and to work on our own private, concerns as a group. That is a right that we have. The 10th Amendment, if you guys know, is the one that reserves powers that are not specifically outlined in the Constitution. And in essence, Article 1, Section 8, powers given to Congress, but not just that, throughout the whole Constitution. The rights that are not reserved specifically to Congress or to the federal government are reserved to the states or to the people respectively. That's the 10th Amendment. And the reason why I bring that one up is because when we're thinking about water, and today I'm using North Prairie Regional Water District as a case study. We're thinking about water, and our use of water in our own area, that is something that traditionally has been considered a state's rights issue. Now, sometimes things get in the way, such as the Environmental Protection Agency and land use and all that sort of thing. That kind of is more Monty's side of being a lawyer. And I'm not here as a lawyer to share things, but just to give you an idea that those are the rules that are supreme. Of course, underneath the United States Constitution and federal law is the North Dakota Century Code, state law. And specifically, Chapter 6135 is the state law covering water districts and goes through all the different powers and duties and responsibilities of water districts. And then in Chapter 4404, that is our North Dakota open meetings and records laws, and also tells organizations, particularly governmental organizations, what they are required to keep as far as records. And so that is an excellent source to go to. Sometimes they are written in some legalese. Ideally, though, there's been a focus over the last probably 20 years to try to simplify or at least clarify code so that regular people can understand it without having to run to an attorney, except for those, of course, minute, small little, concerns that come up once in a great while. So, of course, with North Dakota Century Code, there's other laws that pertain, but those are the two big ones that pertain to this case as far as North Prairie Regional Water District. Okay, moving on. So we have laws, statutes, and ordinances. That's the top authority. The next two are corporate charter and bylaws and constitutions. Now, not all organizations have a corporate charter. Typically, everything that is incorporated does have a corporate charter by law. And so that, holds specific things according to each state. Each state will have a different requirement for what's in people's corporate charters. And then underneath the corporate charter is the bylaws and constitution. Now, when it comes to bylaws and constitution, it used to be that organizations would have both a constitution and a bylaws. And I kind of wrote that funny because traditionally a constitution is even a higher, so it'd kind of go corporate charter, constitution, and then bylaws. But the trend has been lately, and they mentioned this in Robert's rules, that they just prefer to simplify things now and just keep everything in one document, the bylaws. There's still some organizations that have constitutions. I know the political party I came from in Utah does that. Okay, now I did want to point this out. Just as I've got them in order of authority. For example, you cannot have something in your bylaws that contradicts state law or federal. That's not allowed. And again, this is Robert's rules. It recognizes the rule of law and the importance of law. Now, here's something. If you happen to be an organization, you come across something in the bylaws that's contrary to, say, what is in the corporate charter or contrary to a state law, it is definitely in order for you to stand up, especially if it's a continuing breach. If it's a situation that's continuing, you can stand up at any time once you notice it, and that takes precedence over everything else. You would call a point of order, and you would say, Madam Chairwoman or Mr. Chairman, I call a point of order, and they would say, state your point. You say, it's come to my attention that section such and such of our bylaws is contrary to state law. And here is the state law included. And you might be able to explain a little bit at that point. And then the chairwoman or the chairman would then make a ruling based on that. And sometimes if necessary, she or he can turn that over to the assembly to decide. But typically that's seen as important enough that that's taken care of right then. The other business can wait. Okay. And if you ever want a script, know how to do a point of order, that is something I'm working on. I did have something that I can put in the chat box, or I can email you to you afterwards if you want to send me a text. And I'll have my contact information at the end. So, okay, let's move on. Okay, the next level or the section of laws are rules of order. And these are written rules of parliamentary procedure that are consistently followed from meeting to meeting. So this isn't necessarily like rules of order in this in this level, doesn't mean like the meeting rules that are put on an agenda right before a particular meeting. These rules of order are those that are written up specifically for the organization as a whole and that carry on from meeting to meeting. So rules of order will typically, and they tend to be a little bit more formal. Rules of order help the organization decide how they're going to decide, how they're going to reach a decision, how they're going to act on those decisions. So rules of order fall into two different kind of categories. And one is a special rules of order, and those are specific to the organization. Let me move on a little bit here. Okay. So special rules of order is a little bit higher than parliamentary authority. Let me explain to you an example of a special rule of order. For example, in Robert's Rules of Order, just kind of a generic speaking limits is 10 minutes per person, 2 times per issue. Well, if you can, that's kind of just the generic base level of participation. But let's say you've got 100 people in your organization. Are you going to wait around for every person to be able to speak twice, 10 minutes each time on an issue? That would take forever, of course. So a lot of organizations will put in as a special rule of order that we have adopted speaking limits will be 3 minutes per person per issue. Or, only one person, or maybe say one idea is per issue, there will be 3 pros and 3 con speakers. And typically that's what the organization decides. And of course, if there's ever a situation where you need something more, then the organization can choose to suspend the bylaws or suspend the rule, in this case, the special rule of order. That's for another whole different conversation, but that is a possibility. Okay, so you've got those special rules of order that are specific to this organization. Usually they are written up on a separate page and they're kept behind the bylaws. Oh, something I forgot to mention about the bylaws really quick is that in an organization, the bylaws should be made available to every member upon joining the organization. And then the secretary is typically given the primary duty to be the custodian of all the governing documents. And so if you are a member of an organization, go to the secretary and say, hey, I'd like to have a copy of the bylaws, please, so that I know how to be a good member. I know not that many people are kind of geeky like me and like to read the rules, but when it comes for important decisions or important policy debates, it's really helpful to see those bylaws and to read them and understand them. So the secretary is the primary person you can go to in your organization. Okay, coming back to rules of order, there is a whole body of to-dos, like of how you can handle disciplinary issues, how you can handle voting issues, how you can handle amendments, how you can handle like interruptions. There's a whole body of things like that that have already been decided, that have been built upon after years and years of experience. And those are what we call the rules of order in a parliamentary authority. That is what you find, for example, in Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised. It's just tons of, this is how you would handle this situation. And it doesn't make sense for an organization to include all of these things in their own bylaws. And so if it's very common, in fact, Roberts recommends it, that in people's bylaws that they include a section of a parliamentary authority. And so something to the effect of, this organization shall be governed by Robert's Rules, the most current edition of Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised, as long as it doesn't conflict with these bylaws or state or federal law, something similar to that. So just as a heads up, there are other types of parliamentary authorities besides Robert's Rules. For example, legislatures like our North Dakota state legislature follows Mason's rules. Kind of similar in many ways, but more geared towards a legislative elected body that meets, say, 75 days and then, adjourns and is no longer. There's also something called the Standard Code of Parliamentary Procedure, and that one is managed by the International Association of Parliamentarians, and usually we find that it's adopted by physicians and dentists. They kind of go that route more. Not sure why. But by and large, over 85% of organizations in the United States, both private and governmental and quasi-governmental, kind of like the water district is a quasi-governmental, will use Robert's Rules of Order and list that right in their bylaws. So again, you want to make sure that in your organization's bylaws, it states what parliamentary authority you are using. If there is no parliamentary authority listed, then kind of the sky's the limit, but there is kind of just a common law, parliamentary procedure principles, but it's really helpful to have things in writing, as you'll see in just a little bit. Okay, after the rules of order, then we go to standing rules. And again, these are a little less in authority. They still are written, and they cover things like administrative details, for example, and maybe say an organization will have a procedures manual. That would go in here behind special rules of order, behind the bylaws, separate from the parliamentary authority. Some examples are if you want to put in what your meeting time will be on a regular basis. You have everybody wearing name badges, or do you require them to sign in when they come in? Do you have a special place for the guest to sit so that it's easy to tell when it's time for voting? Those administrative details are things that you would put in standing rules, and that would be in a separate sheet behind the special rules of order. And I won't get into huge details here. Well, actually, let me go on to the next thing here. Kind of the main part about all these laws, corporate charter, bylaws, rules of order, standing rules, these are written. And after this come unwritten rules of order. And these are still rules that govern an assembly. You'll very often find unwritten rules that people just use by custom. And some of them are completely harmless and okay, and some of them not. So let me give you a couple examples. An example of a harmless custom that actually kind of threw me for a loop when I first came here to North Dakota was in several different organizations, people would nominate names from the floor, and the chair would say, any more nominations? Any more nominations? Any more nominations? Nominations are closed. Now, there is nothing in Robert's rules that says that the chair has to repeat any more nominations 3 times. I'd never heard of that before. Now, granted, this was my first time coming to North Dakota. But it's not actually a bad idea, because essentially what they're doing is they're making sure that everybody in the assembly has the right to nominate who they want to nominate. It's a way to make sure that nobody's cutting off nominations unfairly. And so it's not a bad custom. However, here's an example of a custom that maybe is not such a good idea, but you'll find it many times in organizations. A lot of times, and I've seen this in political districts too, that when a discussion is going on, pros and cons, and one side doesn't want to let the other side keep going, someone will call out, "Call the question." And then the chairman will go immediately to, "Oh, question's been called. We're going to shut off debate. Let's vote on the issue," and hold a vote. And that's inappropriate. It's actually contrary to Robert's rules. And as you see here on this slide, custom falls to the floor. That's Robert's language, Robert's Rules of Order. Custom falls to the floor when challenged by a point of order citing a higher rule. Now keep in mind, your point of order challenge needs to come immediately. So if you let a lot of time pass on by, usually points of order don't qualify anymore if discussion has already gone on. But let's say this happens and the chairman is about ready to say, "Okay, let's vote on this." You zoom up to the microphone and say, I wrote this out. For example, you say, "Point of order, Mr. Chairman." Mr. Chairman said, "Yes, state your point." You say, "The motion of previous question is out of order while another person is speaking. Furthermore, it must be seconded and passed by a 2/3 vote before debate stops and vote on the main motion is taken." So in other words, just by somebody calling out point of order or somebody calling out call the question doesn't stop discussion immediately. When someone says call the question, what they're meaning is, hey, I'm tired of debate. I want to stop debate. They can't interrupt a speaker while doing it. They have to wait till they have the floor. Somebody else has to second it. And then the whole assembly has to vote, and it has to pass by 2/3 vote to say, okay, let's stop debate, because you're cutting off the rights of other people to debate. And then after that passes and debate is stopped, then you go on and have a vote on the question that you were debating. So that's an example of how you can use point of order to stop a custom that is improper, that is contrary to either Robert's rules, or it could be maybe one of your bylaws or constitutions, or like I mentioned earlier, a state code or a federal code. So if you have any questions on that, definitely be sure to ask me. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, so as you saw there, the kind of as I've written out here, in order of authority, the higher the authority, then the greater the threshold required to either adopt or to change these rules. Now, there's a lot of rules that go into how much of a vote each one and that sort of thing. And that's not the point of this purpose today. So I'm not going to go into all of those. But just to kind of give you an idea, some of them require majority vote, or some of them require a 2/3 vote. Some of these types of laws require a vote of those present. Some of them require a vote of the entire membership. Some of them require, some of them can be moved upon spontaneously and make changes. Others require prior notice. And so this is where, again, it's helpful to have a Robert's Rules of Order book or access to a parliamentarian to say, hey, this is what I want to change. What type of vote, how many people need to vote for it, what prior notice is needed, etc. And again, all of this is to help make sure that there is rule of law, that there is order. That's why we call it Robert's Rules of Order. So, okay, let me ask, does anyone have any questions up to this point? Hey, hearing none, we will move on. So, how are bylaws changed? Now, this is the part that gets very interesting, and I'm going to have to stop the screen in just a second. Oh, okay, I've got a few more slides that I can use. Okay, so how are bylaws changed? Hopefully from the last things that you heard, you know that primarily you should check the bylaws of the organization itself. Check to see what your organization says. How are these changed? And so I have a few examples here with North Prairie Rural Water District. These are based on the bylaws of 2021. And of course, it's lots and lots of words there. And we're going to kind of separate it right now and just focus on the first section. And it's found in section 14.1 of the bylaws. Let me move ahead here. Okay. So North Prairie Rural Water says that these bylaws may be repealed or amended by a vote of a majority. So in other words, now this is interesting because Robert's Rules of Order default says typically it takes a 2/3 vote to amend a bylaw. But remember that bylaws are higher in authority than Robert's Rules, the parliamentary authority. So in this case, North Prairie Rural Water, these bylaws say it only takes a majority vote to change these bylaws. So that's the first point, is how they will be changed. It's by a vote of majority. And if you remember from other lessons, a majority, some people think majority means 50% plus one. Majority simply means more than half. You take the total amount of votes cast and you look to see what is half of that, and it needs to be more than half of that. So, okay. The second section or second thing to point out is who can actually vote. And in this section, it says, by a vote of majority of the participating members present at any regular meeting of the district. Okay, so let's break that down for a second. So participating members. So let's go to the next screen. I thought this would be interesting for you. Going back in the bylaws, the bylaws actually defines what a participating member is. It means a member who is subscribed to and paid the established fee for at least one benefit unit in the district. And if you read further in the definitions, both in the bylaws and in Century Code, benefit unit essentially is what we call a curb stop. So if you also look in Century Code 163501, 01 usually is the definition section of a lot of laws. In this, oh, you know what? I take that back. I apologize. That is where my computer started bugging out. I believe it's section 11 of 1635-01, section 11, that almost has verbatim the same wording, that a participating member is someone who's subscribed to and paid the established fee. So, okay. Let's go back to this really quick. Okay. Okay, so we talked about how by majority vote, participating members, we defined that, anybody who's paid a fee for a curb stop. Now, this is also an important little distinction. Participating members present. I know there's been a lot of talk about proxy votes and that sort of thing. According to the bylaws as they stand right now, only those members who are present are allowed to vote on the bylaw changes. And in a way, I'm really glad that that's written in these bylaws for this reason. If there's an election of officers and those names are known in advance, then it makes sense that people might be able to just say, oh, I know who I want to vote for, and I'll send that in absentee if the bylaws allow that, or I'll show up and I'll drop my vote and it'll count if the bylaws allow that. But when it comes to voting on bylaw amendments, there's so much that can change during the meeting, and amendments can happen, as I'll talk about later, during the meeting, that it makes sense that only those people who are present should be allowed to vote on those bylaw changes. And I do like how it says the bylaws can be amended or they can be repealed, like cut out altogether. Now there's some provisos we'll go into in just a little bit. So that is the who. And something I didn't point out earlier, by the way, and I don't have a screen for, is who can bring up who can propose a bylaw. A lot of times, or a bylaw amendment. In some bylaws, it will actually say that maybe any member can propose a bylaw, but it has to go through a bylaws committee first. Or maybe only officers, or maybe only certain delegates or a certain class of members can propose bylaw amendments. Some bylaws say that. These bylaws don't. So basically, any member, because it doesn't say that, then it goes to default Robert's rules, which means that any member who has that authority given to them can participate in the meeting, can bring forth a bylaw. Now, exactly where it is, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. Okay. Oh, sorry, here we go. Where? That's on this slide. Sorry about that, guys. Okay. Again, section 14.1 will say participating members present at any regular meeting of the district or any special meeting of the district. Now, in the bylaws, it does allow for district members or board members or the chairwoman, the presiding officer of the organization. Either one of those three groups can call for meetings of the district. Of course, we have an annual meeting coming up on June 4th. And so that is a regular meeting that's set up in the bylaws. And so it is in order to propose amendments to the bylaws at those meetings. Anybody can, so that's a regular meeting. But again, if somebody wants to say after this annual meeting, somebody's not happy or feels like, no, we need to make more changes to the bylaws, then they can go through the proper process, try to convince a certain number of people to present to the board. I forget exactly how it works out according to the bylaws, but essentially a certain number of members can petition to have a special meeting called. And then at that special meeting, further bylaws amendments can be considered. So, hey. Final thing I wanted to point on here, and again, I apologize, I wanted to split this up. This is about the time that my computer started bugging out. So the first sentence here of this, let's go back. The first sentence here of this Article 14 amendments is what we just covered. The rest of this, I think, is really interesting and shows why it shows the nature of North Prairie Regional Water District as a quasi-governmental organization. It's ruled by the members, but it also has some duties some fiduciary duties, especially to state and local and even federal organizations. And so it says, we can have amendments. But look at this. So long as indebtedness is held or guaranteed by USDA Rural Utility Service or other lending agencies or their people, the participating members shall not have the power to change the purposes of the district so as to decrease its rights and powers under the laws of the state, or to waive any, requirements of bond or other provision for the safety and security of property and funds of the district. Okay, so basically that is a limit upon the members. The members are allowed to make amendments, but there is a check on that. We can't make any bylaws that would essentially change the whole purpose of the water district, that would fundamentally change the relationship that the district has with the people it's gone into debt for. Because there are contracts that are made. There is debt that's been taken on, and that debt needs to be paid back. And so because of that, it does say down here that, let me go back, that pretty much there does need to be some notice given and an approval given by the USDA Rural Utility Service or other lending organizations, just to make sure that the bylaws aren't going to mess things up. Now, to be honest, this is where the help of a lawyer, such as, the lawyer that the district has contracted with, that would be really helpful to help the organization mitigate the differing interests there. At the same time, this is actually one thing that can be done. Because of course, it'd be easy for a water district, maybe management, to say, well, you can't pass anything if you haven't gotten approval by this official branch or this official group. Well, the members could go ahead and put in a proviso saying, we want to make this change, but depending on getting approval by such and such authorities, and by this date, it will go into effect. Or maybe say it will go into effect as of this date, unless, such and such authorities do not approve of it. In that case, we will call another special meeting or whatever. These are things that individual members can come up with themselves. Or if someone is bringing up a bylaw change or a bylaw amendment, that is something you can stand up and make an amendment to that amendment and add that proviso on there, or proviso, however you pronounce it, proviso, to make sure that it's done properly and according to the bylaws of this organization. So does anyone have any questions to this point? Hopefully it's as clear as mud.
I don't have a question, but can I make a comment?
Yes, please do, Monty.
Sure. So I agree with, I think, almost everything that you presented here, except, well, and I don't know if it's an exception. One of I think the controversies that the district is going to have at its annual meeting is about bylaw amendments from the floor. And you just identified one of the exact issues that I had looked at as legal counsel for the district, which is the problem. There's several problems with bylaw amendments from the floor. First of all, there are certain provisions within the law that the bylaws can't modify, right? And you've outlined that in the Century Code and the Constitution and in the governing rules for political subdivisions.
Exactly.
Right. And second, there are terms in various loan documents with the USDA and other lenders that can't be put at risk. And third, the way the bylaws are written is that the fundamental nature of the district can't change through the bylaw process. And then finally, because the district is a political subdivision of the state, it is bound by the open records and open meeting laws, which normally require that for meetings, and I would consider an annual meeting, even though it's held regularly, to be somewhat like a special meeting because it's not held at the same time in the same place. There's requirements that those meetings have notice of the topics that are going to be covered. Those things altogether really mitigate against the efficacy of having bylaw changes made from the floor where there's no notice to anybody. There's no checking with the lenders or USDA. There's no analysis of any of those things. And then also problematic is that a quorum of this entity under its bylaws is basically whoever shows up at a meeting. And so you have and as you noted, the bylaws may be amended by a simple majority of the people present. So you run the real risk of a small group of participating members appearing at an annual meeting without any notice and creating complete havoc with the political subdivision. I mean, this isn't like Toastmasters, right? I mean, this is a political subdivision of the state that has to operate its basically a $1 million business. And so the challenge, I think, for the district was that's a lot of potential chaos. And so the only thing that I would disagree with you on is that my reading of the bylaws and of the powers of political subdivision and the case law that I could find is that the board has some ability to pass rules for the governance of the entity, saying that, you know what, if you want to have if the members want to call a special meeting to have bylaw changes, they absolutely have that right, and nobody's questioning that. And the rules and the bylaws for a special meeting require that the topic of the special meeting be announced ahead of time so everybody can have notice and we can review and analyze. It did not make sense to me that the annual meeting would be completely wide open, where there would be no notice. The members would not have any idea ahead of time what was going to happen at that meeting. And so somewhat at my recommendation, what the board has passed are rules. And again, the bylaws give the board the ability to pass rules for the governance of the entity, which basically state that there will not be a proposed bylaw amendments from the floor. And those are the standing rules of the district that we believe supersede anything in Robert's rules to the contrary. And so that would be my only comment about what you presented, is I agree with pretty much everything else. But that at this annual meeting, motions to amend the bylaws will not be in order and they will not be recognized because the board has passed special rules concerning what the agenda will be. And it doesn't mean that the members don't have that ability. They will just have to do it through a different mechanism where there'll be full notice, and the open records laws and the open meeting laws will all potentially be followed. And these provisions for the USDA and these other things can be looked at ahead of time as a solution. And that's the solution that this board has adopted for those issues.
Okay. Well, hey, I appreciate you sharing your opinion on that. And that is a very well reasoned, well thought out opinion. And I can definitely see how you would consider that. And I do apologize. I was hoping to have this second section like worked out with all the Robert's Rules of Order references. Unfortunately, my computer kept cutting out depending on, I tried 4 different servers, and a whole section that I had worked on was wiped out completely. So if you're interested, Monty, then I can definitely write up just a short opinion for you to state specific parts of Robert's rules. And so this is how I would respond to you, just kind of off the cuff, is that you're right that the board has been given power as the governing body of, or as a governing body of this organization. But their decisions mount to standing rules, which are lesser in authority than the parliamentary authority. Or, I mean, if they want to make it a special rule of order, then that would require an additional level, like I mentioned before, an additional threshold, a higher threshold of decision making, essentially kind of to the level almost of putting it into the bylaws. So a standing rule is lower than Robert's Rules of Order. Robert's Rules of Order does say that when a bylaw amendment is presented to the body, and in this case, a deliberative body, which is the members are empowered by the bylaws, and particularly these bylaws, not just Robert's Rules, but these bylaws give the members the authority to make amendments. And in particular, and I would change this going forward, but at this point, these bylaws leave the floor wide open. For there is no prior notice requirement in this. So maybe there is prior notice requirement in state law generally, but to a certain extent, the board has already done that by advertising to everybody that there will be this large bylaw amendment or series of bylaw amendments. So that notice has already gone out to the entire membership. And I am so glad, Monty. In fact, I'm very, very grateful that you encouraged the board to do that extra work. And I know it must have been exhausting to go to meeting after meeting, but that really created the opportunity for a lot of member buy-in, which is so important, because without that, things can get so confusing and so difficult already. But per these bylaws, and they weren't required to do that. Neither is any member required to do that under these bylaws. When it comes to state code, as far as, public notice, I believe that level has been met because of what the board has put out already. There will be bylaw amendments. On top of that, Robert's Rules does say that when an amendment is brought to the floor, that the deliberative body who will be voting on that amendment has the right to make amendments to that amendment. And specifically with bylaw amendments, it can be perfected to the second degree. And I'll get into that with another slide in just a second. And then on top of that, the board has gone one step further. It's not just one single bylaw amendment or maybe 3 or 4 bylaw amendments that they've proposed. They've proposed so many changes to the document that it amounts to what's called a bylaws revision. And according to Robert's Rules, and because there is nothing in the bylaws governing this, then it goes to Robert's Rules, a bylaws revision is required to be considered seriatim. In other words, article by article. I do know there was some discussion at the board level of trying to simplify it, maybe separate into these different sections, the ability for the board to govern itself, kind of some, then all the capitalization and punctuation stuff changes, and then the ability to vote absentee. That's all fine and good. If each one of those had been written up separately and proposed to the body, then that would be appropriate. But the way that they've put it together and they've presented it, it amounts to a bylaws revision. And at a bylaw revision, the entire thing essentially is open up for revision or substitution completely. Now, I'm hoping to spare you a heart attack because there was a decision made that we would not propose an entire substitution of the entire thing. Sure. Mainly because I could not write up something that quick and get another lawyer to look at it, etc. I do believe there is a very strong case to be made, and I believe it would hold up in the courts as well, because members are given the authority here in the bylaws to propose these amendments, that it is out of order for the board to impose upon the membership an additional barrier to say, no, you can't make any amendments from the floor.
Sure. And I think that the question then obviously is about this conflict between an interpretation of the member's authority under Robert's Rules and the board's authority under the bylaws and the Century Code. Mm-hmm. And how does that conflict get resolved? And I don't know that the members are going to like the answer, but I think that conflict gets resolved by the board as the deliberative body for the district, and it doesn't get resolved by the members. And so,
well, but you know what? I do want to interrupt you here, though.
Sure.
That is a different perspective, but another perspective that also goes along with Robert's Rules, and I was just tested on this in my parliamentary exam, is that when you have a board that is specifically set above, how do I say it? If you have a board that is, if the board is elected by the members,
right,
then the board does give way in precedence to the overall voice of the members. And of course, because it's a quasi-governmental authority, there's also, the provisions of state law, state law with Section 60 or Title 65 does get in there and say, okay, water districts have this power. But beyond that power that's given to them in the code and beyond the power that is given in the bylaws, the members hold the remainder of that power. They are the ones that elect the members of the board. They have especially according to these bylaws right now, they have the power to remove the members of the board. And so because of that, different to, say, for example, a corporate structure where the board is above, the general shareholders or membership or whatever, organizations may be. In this case, this board is subservient to the overall organization. So, and for example, this section right here supports that because it is not the board that gets to make the changes to or even just make the amendment and have an up or down vote. It is the members who can make the amendments. So,
Right.
So
Yeah,
it
well,
is, it's a difference of opinion. It's a different way of looking at it. And so that will be, I'm grateful you asked this because I think there are a lot of people that this line of reasoning will make a lot more sense to them than perhaps the line of reasoning that you and the majority of the board are coming from. And I think it will really come down to the right of the members, the overall members, the collective voice to make a decision as to how the North Prairie Regional Water District will govern itself.
Yeah, and I think that the collision point is not going to perhaps resolve this, right? Because I think that at some point the board and the officers of the district are going to decide these issues. And I think the remedy for the members is probably going to have to be someone, if they feel strongly about it, is to seek judicial intervention by a judge, because I don't see that what you're suggesting is going to the members at some point are going to have to follow the rules that the board have adopted.
To a certain extent, but at that same point though, the board is allowed to make certain laws, but they are held accountable to the members, and the members do have the right to repeal or to rescind decisions made by the board.
Certainly, and I agree with you. The members can remove board members through the process in the bylaws. They can have special meetings with special pre-noticed changes to the bylaws. But at the point that the procedural rules intersect with the substantive rules, my opinion is that the board has the superior ability to set the substantive decisions for the because it's a political subdivision, and it's not a member-controlled political subdivision. It's a board-controlled political subdivision, and those decisions are subject to review ultimately through the bylaws, the specific things in the bylaws, similar to recalling of city officials or referral of ordinances and things of that nature.
Yeah.
But ultimately,
no, I would be. Oh, go ahead.
I was just saying, but ultimately, I think that whether or not the board is properly exercising its authority under the law that conflict is not going to get resolved at the annual meeting. To the extent that there's conflict, that conflict is probably going to have to get resolved by a district court judge, by somebody suing the board. That's kind of how I see, if there's really a dispute, how it's going to get resolved. I don't think it's going to get resolved at the annual meeting in the way that I think some of the members are proposing, simply because the board has the authority to set the substantive rules, subject, again, always of executive branch, subject to some review by a state court judge.
Yeah.
But in that,
so Monty, would you do me a favor? Because
Sure.
I think I could really be an influence, either which way, and I can be persuaded, obviously. For example,
that's why I'm here, right?
Yeah,
I
exactly.
To hear what you had to say. And
if you remember, I don't know if you were there at the North Dakota State Convention, State Republican Party Convention, but there had been, discussions in advance of, we need to change the rules that they're doing stink and And there were a lot of people that wanted to change certain rules, but I was the one who stood up in advance and said, hey, after we'd had all that discussion about District 37, I was the one who stood up and said, hey, from my perspective as a parliamentarian, I reached out to some other professional parliamentarians. They looked at the law, they looked at the bylaws of this party. And it's my opinion that if we have a debate over what rule to do or not, that it'll go down a rabbit hole. And to save time and to do things appropriately, I think we should adopt these rules the way they're written. And if there are changes that need to be made, they need to be handled at the state legislative level or at the state committee level. And quite frankly, people that resonated with them, and that closed that discussion, and we were able to move on. So, if you can share with me some case law, or probably the thing that I have the biggest question of is you're talking about substantive rules, because in my mind, substantive rules, where did they fall? I'm going to go back really quick to the little diagram that I have here. Where do they fall in? They obviously are not, those rules are not included in the bylaws.
Well, but I think
if you
you're
can
missing,
show me, hold
yeah,
on, if you can show me something that's in, section, Title 65, that is a law or a statute or an ordinance, or, but if you see the rules of order, let me go back a little bit more. What I see you talking about, policies and things that the board does, are they special rules of order, or are they standing rules?
well, I'll start with the idea that the district is a political subdivision of the state. And so it has whatever authority that the state century code provides it, plus some implied powers based on the fact that it's a political subdivision, plus when you interpret the board's authority and when you interpret the bylaws, you have to interpret them consistent with other provisions of law. So for instance, the open records laws or the open meeting laws have to be read into the bylaws. And the bylaws themselves give the board great authority, including a specific provision of the bylaws that allow, and I set all this out in a memo. I don't know if you looked at it, but provides the board with the ability to pass rules that govern the administration. I can't remember the exact words in the bylaws right now, but the governance of the district. The board has the ability to pass those rules, notwithstanding something in the bylaws that prohibits it. And so the legal question is whether not from Robert's rules. Robert's rules are procedural rules. The case law that I can find, and the only state I could find case law out of was out of Ohio. The case law suggests that you can't, at least in Ohio, I don't know what North Dakota would do, but probably would follow what Ohio has done. You can't sue an entity, a public entity, for failure to follow Robert's rules, that they're not substantive rules, they're procedural rules that are subject to the discretion of the governing entity. And I cite that in the memo. And so the question is really about interpretation of the bylaws and whether or not the bylaws allow the board the authority to present bylaw changes in the manner in which they're being presented at this annual meeting, whether the bylaws give the board the authority to set the rules for the agenda at the annual meeting, these types of things. My experience as a lawyer is that most courts will defer to the interpretation of these provisions to how the board defines them, and will give the board discretion to interpret these rules as long as there's not something specific that the board is violating. And I understand people say, well, we disagree with that. We think the board's interpreting these rules incorrectly. And so the question becomes, is who has the burden of, so to speak, who has the burden of proof? Does the board have to prove that it has the authority, or does somebody have to prove that the board doesn't have that authority? And then the second question is, who decides that controversy? And what I'm saying is that I think the board has that authority subject to some member or some other interested party challenging it, and that the place that will be challenged is not at the annual meeting, but through some kind of court action. And that at the annual meeting, what is going to happen, I suspect, is that attempts to use Robert's rules in a way that's inconsistent with the rules adopted by the board will be ruled out of order, and there won't be the vehicle for dealing with these issues in the way that you would suggest Robert's rules would allow, because they're not, this isn't a procedural question, it's a substantive question, and Robert's rules really has nothing to say about the substance of what is allowed at the meeting.
On the other hand, though, unfortunately, the one flaw in your particular argument is that in this case, the bylaws do definitely give the members the authority to deal with bylaws at the agenda or at the annual meeting. And there's nothing in the bylaws that either that says that the board has the power to limit the ability of members to do that. And so that really is, that's kind of, I think, the deciding point right there. And if I remember right, I've been in multiple conversations where when it comes to these types of issues, at least our current situation here in North Dakota, a lot of times when there is a movement of the members to determine that question, then that is weighed more heavily than a small body of elected board members who are subject to the membership. So, you know, and maybe it just might be that the Attorney General doesn't want to deal with it and doesn't want to have to, he's like, okay, well, you know what? The membership have spoken, they're allowed to make, you know, to vote, they're allowed to, you know, choose what they do with the, you know, who's on the board. They have the power to remove people from the board.
I don't think the Attorney General has any real jurisdiction over.
Well, but that's what you were,
this.
but you were kind of saying, you know, when it comes to a question of, you know, what kind of laws, and you're right, it would end up potentially in the courts.
Would be you'd have to get a district court judge to sort out whether or not the board is acting outside of its authority.
Yeah, but ultimately, because the bylaws also state Robert's Rules of Order as the parliamentary authority, that also gives the people the power to use Robert's rules in the different procedural motions. And so if the board is acting outside of those procedural motions, and if the board does not have the power given to it specifically in the bylaws or specifically in state code, right, then that's where the clashing point comes.
Right, and that's what I think the disagreement is, right? Is that what you just said, does the board have the specific ability to do what it's done in the bylaws?
Yeah.
And I think that's the disagreement, right? And so my opinion as the board's lawyer is it does have this specific authority to pass rules governing the district, and that's an authority that's not only in the bylaws, but it's consistent with its general powers under the Century Code as a political subdivision of the state, and in some of the board's inherent powers. And so once the board has come up with that interpretation of its authority and it's exercising that authority, the question I think becomes, okay, well, what is the vehicle for challenging that? And of course, there's several vehicles. One is a special meeting, amendments to the bylaws, right? There are vehicles for it. Isn't that the board is saying there's nothing, we've made our decision, there's nothing the members can do, right? That's not the case at all. That's, I think, how it's being portrayed is like, oh, the board has made this decision and now the members are going to lose their district because the board's made this decision. The question is how that decision is challenged. And there are ways that it can be challenged. And I recognize that the members can call a special meeting. They can move to remove a board member or more board members under the bylaws, or they can challenge the board's interpretation of the bylaws in a court. What I'm suggesting is that trying to adjudicate this issue at the annual meeting is not going to be successful, because there is no way for the members to enforce or to adjudicate that issue at the annual meeting. And so that, again, part of the reason I got on the Zoom call was to have this, hopefully to have this conversation with you. And thank you for letting me stay, because I wasn't sure I would be allowed to stay.
Oh, you
But
bet.
it's just to say, look, this isn't some evil, rotten plan, right? This is real world, complicated application of law and facts to questions that aren't clear. I've done my best to advise the board. Reasonable people can disagree. That isn't what the question is. The question is, when reasonable people disagree, how will that disagreement get resolved? And having people show up at the annual meeting and make multiple points of order is not probably going to resolve this dispute. This dispute's going to have to be either resolved in some other process within the bylaws.
And I would just say, Monty, I would respectfully disagree with you, because I truly believe that the way the bylaws are written up, and because of the quasi-governmental way that this organization has been set up in the bylaws, that the members do have a certain level of check, and that the annual meeting is an appropriate time for that check to happen. So, you know,
well, I can tell you that as the counsel for the board, that I doubt very highly that these issues will be adjudicated at the annual meeting. More than likely, what will happen is that these issues will be ruled to be out of order. They're and that they're not parliamentary issues, they're legal issues. And so we have a parliamentarian who will decide parliamentary issues, and you have a counsel for the district who will decide legal issues, and those are two separate things. And I'm, you know, assuming I'm still counsel for the district at the time that the annual meeting occurs, I can tell you that I don't believe that these issues are properly adjudicated at the annual meeting. There is a method to adjudicate them, and it's not that I'm saying my opinion is the only opinion that matters, and that it can't be challenged. It just can't be challenged in this way, right? The board has determined.
See, and I guess my concern is I will read again over the opinion that that you shared. And if you want to, you know, share some more information with me, please, by all means do. I am not convinced that this is not the appropriate way, and that this is not the appropriate vehicle for the people, especially if it ends up being a majority of the membership stands up and says, no, we feel that this is the way that it should be decided.
How do they do that when it's not in order? How do they do that?
I would definitely say check up point of order.
Okay.
So
it's not a point of order that's subject to decision by the assembly, right? So for instance, if the assembly stood up and wanted to do something that was clearly illegal.
Yeah. Like,
right?
Let's go out and set off fireworks, you know, without having a proper fire permit or whatever.
Right. If the assembly gets up and suggests something that's clearly illegal, the chair would say that that's not even in front of the assembly. There can be no point of order on that issue. We're not subject to a vote of the assembly. It's beyond the power of the entity of the organization. It violates the Constitution or something else, right? It's outside of the legal bounds of what we can have a meeting on. And so it's not subject to a vote of the assembly. And what I'm telling you is that's where I think we are with these issues, is they're outside of it's a legal decision that has been made. It's outside of the adjudication of the assembly. And the assembly, therefore, is not going to have the resolution on these issues, because it's been decided that these are not properly in front of the assembly. There are issues that are properly in front of the assembly, and these issues can become proper issues for the assembly, but that they won't be part of the meeting, the annual meeting. And I think that people are who don't understand that will be looking at Robert's rules and saying, well, this is an issue of Robert's rules. It's not an issue of Robert's rules. It's an issue of substantive law. And Robert's rules can't create the substantive law, and it can't modify the substantive law. It can only modify the procedure to be used at the meeting. And so that's what the conversation I wanted to have with you is that this isn't about the district not following Robert's rules. It's about the district making a decision about the substance of the meeting, and that's a legal determination. It's not a procedural determination. And so the Roberts rules is not helpful on that issue.
Okay. So what you're saying when you say substantive rules, you're kind of pointing more towards this laws, statutes, and ordinances, correct?
Yep. I'm saying that the district governed by this board of directors is drawing authority from the governing statutes and from the bylaws, not from Robert's rules. And from that has made decisions about what is in bounds and what is not in bounds for this meeting. And it's not, again, it's not that those decisions can't be challenged. They just probably can't be challenged, or they won't be subject to challenge at the meeting. Okay,
so let me ask you this then, because I definitely appreciate the you helping and walking me through this. So what would be the vehicles to make certain changes that people may want to make when it comes to, the bylaws or whatever? Obviously you mentioned that, a member could take it to the courts and have a district court determine, was the board overstepping its authority? Were they operating within the bounds of law and within bounds of their bylaws? That obviously is one vehicle or one method to challenge that. And yet, of course, there is such a high barrier when it comes to, somebody having to have the money to take on that kind of challenge and the time, et cetera. What other remedies are there besides
well, the simplest,
challenging it?
Okay, so what I would say is that first, that all of the members have an opportunity to come to the board and ask the board to either call a special meeting, right? The board can call a special meeting and convince the board. But assuming that you were a member and you believe the board was not doing things appropriately, right? Which is not my business as a lawyer for the district, right? That's a matter for the members, and right.
Exactly.
But the threshold for calling a special meeting is not overwhelming under the bylaws. There's a process for that, and so you could draft up your call for a special meeting. You could set out what you wanted your bylaw changes to be, or what you were proposing. Right. And the only limit is the bylaws would say that if you're going to call a special meeting for something substantive, that's the only topic at the meeting. Right. So you couldn't have a special meeting where somebody stands up and says from the floor, oh, in addition to this resolution about running a new water line to, such and such a town, while we're all here, let's talk about the bylaws. You wouldn't be able to do that at a special meeting. Right.
Correct, because that would be outside the scope.
Right,
and Robert's rules talks about that as well. So that makes sense.
Okay, so again, the only point I'm trying to make is on this is that it's not that the board is saying to the members, you're just out of luck. You don't have any ability to do these things. We've taken this from you. No, what the board is saying is that for the reasons that I mentioned at the beginning, for notice, and for making sure that any bylaw change is consistent with the parts of the bylaws that require that they not affect the fundamental nature of the district or the USDA. And you in your presentation recognized that they could get afoul of that without recognizing that they did it. Now you suggested a remedy, which is a conditional, passing something conditionally, which has its own set of problems for the district, because now you've
Mhm.
got bylaws that have been adopted by the members. Now what? The board's going to come and say these aren't effective because there
Yeah.
is a problem with you, right? I mean, and again, this is a governmental entity that has to continue to operate in the face of this confusion, right? So there's
Yeah.
no elegant solution to this.
Yeah.
What the
agreed.
board has suggested is that in the absence of something clear in the bylaws, let's be guided by the idea of complete notice. Let's be guided by the idea of concrete bylaws that are vetted ahead of time before the
Mhm.
meeting, right? I mean, again, there are policy reasons for doing it the way that you suggest, but there are also policy reasons for doing it the way the board suggests, which have
Mhm.
nothing to do with any kind of wrongdoing or corruption or anything else. They're
Oh, yeah.
like, hey, there's some real practical considerations. We'll err on the side of caution, knowing that the members still have both free access to the courts if they want to challenge what we're doing legally, and the
Mhm.
ability to recall us under the bylaws if they want to challenge the members, and the ability to call a special meeting, and the ability to come to the board and say, hey, we want the board to call for a special meeting, right? There are
Mhm. Yeah.
multiple avenues for the
So,
members to be involved. We're
yeah.
just saying that at an annual meeting, it doesn't make sense to have an annual meeting where there's a free for all as to what the bylaws are going to look like at the end of that annual meeting. And
Mhm.
that because the threshold is so low for a change, basically a majority of the people who show
Yeah.
up, we think this is not a good way to run a governmental entity. Now,
And
I
I
think,
would agree with you to a certain extent. My one question for you though, kind of following on the logic though, is that if the board is saying right now, we're making a policy or making a substantive, rule that these things are inappropriate to come to this meeting, then what's to stop them from, a board of a group of people coming to the board and saying, hey, we want to have this special meeting, or them calling a special meeting and the board coming together and saying, we don't want you passing that kind of rule. We don't want to have that discussion. What's the difference between those two? Because what
right,
I'm kind of hearing is giving or allowing the board, or interpreting that the board has the authority to limit these things this time for this
mhm.
annual meeting. What's to keep them from having that same power at a future district meeting?
Well, what I would
Because they could
say,
step in and just say, oh, we don't like this anyway. We're not going to let you do it next time either.
right. So I think the distinction is that there the overreach by a governmental entity is what prevents an overreach is recall, right? Being able to recall people in the courts,
Mhm.
right? That's what prevents the overreach. If so, if you say, well, what keeps the board from doing the wrong thing in the future? I would say, well, it's the wrong
Mhm.
thing and there's a remedy. Why is that a wrong thing? It's a wrong thing because the bylaws allow for a special meeting with a specific agenda,
Mhm.
right? So the only thing the board has done here is say, look, we're not going to have a meeting without a specific agenda and proper notice of what's going to happen. That's the limiting factor. And so you say, well, is there anything in the bylaws that precludes the board from saying we're not going to have a meeting without a specific agenda and proper notice as to what's going to be considered? And you look at the bylaws and you say, no, there's nothing in the bylaws that says that. There is some generic language about the members having the ability at a annual meeting to adopt the bylaws, but then you look at the
Adopt
limitation
or amend or repeal.
or repeal, right?
Yeah.
But then you say, okay, but how do they do that? Can the board adopt rules about how that happens and what kind of notice that has to happen ahead of time? And then you look at the rules for a special meeting, and they require very specific notice, and it's a very
Exactly.
closed system. And you say, okay, well, two types of meetings. One is an annual meeting, which what you're suggesting is wide open to anything that the members want to bring. And the other is a special meeting, which is very, very similar, but is limited to only the things that are part of the special meeting notice.
Correct.
Well, my view is that a judge or a court who looks at this is going to read into the annual meeting the same kind of notice requirement as a special meeting, especially if that notice is adopted as a rule by the board and the board has specific authority to adopt rules for the governance of the district. When I string those things together and I add the open meeting requirements and the idea that we want to have notice, I'm very comfortable with my opinion. Right now, judge could say I'm wrong, but the reason this conversation is, I think, necessary is that I'm not just making this stuff up, right? I mean, I spent some time looking at this, thinking my way through. I searched all through Westlaw for cases involving Robert's Rules and whether Robert's Rules was enforced by judges. And the only cases I could find are cited in my memorandum, which suggests that Robert's Rules is not really going to be, at least in the state of Ohio, which is one of the only states I could find it, is not. And there's a legal treatise that was cited in that case, basically saying they're procedural rules and courts aren't going to get involved in those procedural rules. So reasonable people can disagree about the law. The question is, how are we going to resolve those disagreements? And what I'm suggesting to you again is probably not at the annual meeting using Robert's Rules and points of order. We're not going to probably get to resolution that people are going to be happy with in that process. Doesn't mean there's not a way to resolve those disputes civilly, right? And legally. It's just that probably not going to do it through a Robert's Rules of Order process at an annual meeting where you have 300 or 400 people in a room and people's tempers are going to get up. And, you know, that's why I'm here, right? Because I'm concerned about that and the chaos that are created, because the issues that you and I are talking about are very, very complicated legal issues. Yeah, they are. There isn't a clear answer.
Kind of. Some of them are complicated. Some of them are.
Well, but there's not a clear answer, right? There's not a clear answer. And most people think, oh, well, it's Robert's Rules and we have this right. Well, no, it's more complicated to that. And I put my opinion in writing and I cited the case law and I cited the statutory authority for it. Yeah. And ultimately that, whether I'm correct or not, is not going to be adjudicated at the annual meeting. It's going to be adjudicated in some other forum. And that's fine. I do this for a living. I'm not always correct and judges don't always agree with me, but very seldom is it going to be decided in a point of order, right? That's my point. It's probably not going to be decided that way. It's going to be decided in a different way.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. And you know, you kind of reminded me, maybe it would be good for me to put kind of my thoughts and reasonings behind this into a written opinion as well, so that people can see that in advance and kind of be able to take a look at a larger, here are thoughts and ideas on this side. This is what Monty has shared. This is what a parliamentarian has shared. One way of looking at it, and then let people decide, who will be going there. So I do appreciate it. The last thing that we really want is a lot of hot tempers, a lot of angry people, a lot of people feeling disenfranchised or picked on. That's the very thing that Robert's Rules was designed to avoid. That's, Henry Roberts, I'm sure at the beginning started Robert's Rules of Order because he went to a church meeting that was absolutely chaos. It was a public social meeting in a church. So it wasn't a church meeting.
Sure.
And he finally thought, there's got to be a better way about this. And so that's when he wrote his little booklet, and, it's gone on from there. So, and it's fascinating to me, the interplay between these different issues and the legal side versus the procedural side. And when it comes right down to it, how amazing it is that we, as American citizens, have the ability to have these conversations, to be able to govern ourselves, to assemble together, to have our own government, to try to figure out these difficult issues in a way that doesn't involve pitchforks and bonfires.
Well, that's the point, right? Which is that these are difficult issues, and at the end of the day, the district has to operate like, again, if not to underplay this, but if
Mhm.
your Elks Club or your Toastmasters Club or your church, for instance, if it has a governance issue and it can't resolve it and chaos ensues, that's bad, right? That's bad. Robert's Rules is designed to help these entities, right, find a way through their governing issues. But the district is a political subdivision of the state. It has to deliver water. It has to operate, right? It can't be in a position where it doesn't have a clear answer. It can't be in a position where it can't get financing because it's got bylaw provisions which may or may not be in effect, right? Or that has officers which cannot sign contracts because it's not clear who the officers, right? There are practical considerations when you talk about governmental entities. And so that is the thing that I want people to understand, is that at some point the board has to make a decision and then move forward with that, understanding that it has responsibilities as a political subdivision of the state. It has to follow the law, but where the law is not clear, it probably just has to decide what the law is and move forward, protecting its ability to function. And the people have a remedy. I don't want people to feel like there's no remedy. The remedy just probably isn't Robert's Rules at an annual meeting. There are other remedies that people will have to pursue, and that's just probably the way it's probably going to end up. But I'm happy to look at at somebody else's opinion. I mean, again, I'm happy to consider it, but I just think the idea of unnoticed bylaw changes for a multi-million-dollar political subdivision that has to keep operating is just not I don't think any judge in any court is going to say that this is a proper exercise of the people's power. I think a judge is going to say, yeah, this is a reasonable way of sorting out the people's ability to pass bylaw changes and the entity's ability to function.
Okay.
That's
Sounds
my opinion.
good. Hey, I appreciate that. And so, yeah, I will do what I can. Obviously, I have a lot of things going on, but that is something, if I can prepare something in writing ahead of time to share people who maybe are concerned about perhaps the information that you put out, maybe I can give them a different thing and share with them also, hey, Monty has, the legal argument, I've been made, it feels right to me that this, XYZ. However, I disagree with ABC or, that sort of thing. So yeah, that's something I will work on. So I appreciate that. So thank you. Let's go ahead and I can't believe it. It's already 9:30 or 9:35. So let's see. You know what? Because my other part of the presentation actually had to go over like how to amend bylaws as far as primary and secondary amendments, and whether you insert or add or strike or insert and strike. And then there's also revisions. Oh, Monty, maybe this is one thing that I do want to ask you though, however, that is a really good question. Is in Robert's Rules, it does say when there is a bylaw, I kind of mentioned it already, I think, when there is a wholesale bylaw revision, that it does need to be considered seriatim. In other words, article by article by article. So maybe if the board, let's say the board, there is a prevailing decision by the assembly that, okay, maybe we can't necessarily do full scale amendments to these proposed amendments, but that it does need to be gone through seriatim, like section by section. Is there a good reasoning not to do it that way?
Well, I think practically there are practical issues with presenting bylaw change. I understand what you're saying. You article by article.
Yeah.
There are practical reasons why that is difficult when you've got, again, the vote here is not one person, one vote. The vote here is one vote per curb stop.
although if you look at it, it does, okay, one vote per curb stop.
One vote per curb stop. So the logistics of
Mhm.
having 50 or 100 votes with 300 to 500 people with multiple votes per person.
Oh,
right?
I agree with you. I was
Okay,
wondering
so
about that. I was like, whoa,
so
that's crazy.
so again, what I would say is that Robert's rules govern that unless the board has the ability or something gives the board the ability to present this in a different way, and the board has presented it. And what I would say to the members is, if the way that these are being presented, there are things that you're being asked to vote in favor of because they're in a group and there are parts of the group that you're in favor of and parts you're against, your remedy is to vote against it, and then it won't pass and nothing will change. I mean, it's, again, it isn't that the members are without ability here. They have the ability to decide based on the way that the information is presented, whether they're going to vote in favor of it or against it. And that isn't uncommon. I mean, there are statutory referrals, things that are referred to the voters, and constitutional things that have been referred to the voters that have included provisions that people like and that other provisions that people don't like, and they vote as a unit, right? It becomes as a unit because that's how it's referred. This isn't any different. And to the extent that there's a specific bylaw change that somebody wants, just a certain thing, that it can be proposed as part of a special meeting, or several of them can be proposed as part of a special meeting. But there are practical reasons why you don't want to do bylaw changes seriatim. And the board, initially, I believe, was going to submit these as an up or down vote on all of them. And then after they had some of the informational meetings, my understanding that the board said, no, the members want more choices. And so now I believe they're being presented in a group of 4 or 5 different I can't remember, I don't have them in front of me, but they are trying to give the members, I tried to help the board group them into things that seem to be logically the same. But again, the members have the ability to say yes or no for each grouping, and if they don't like the way they're presented, they can vote no.
Gotcha. Exactly. Okay, that helps answer my question on that. So I appreciate that. That makes sense. So okay. Okay, well, thank you, everybody, and thank you, Monty, for taking the time to watch this meeting and to listen and to understand and have this conversation. I feel like it was very, very helpful, and I appreciate your time. So, as far as anybody else who is on this call, and just a reminder, this is recorded, and so I will be right after this meeting. I promise you, I will find a way to put it on YouTube. And after that, once I figure that out, then I'll figure out how to put all my other 10 episodes up as well. But are there any other questions from anybody else on this phone call at all?
Is it all right if I answer Ms. Moreno's question there about who I represent?
Yes.
Yeah, so because I know that she's asked me this question before. So as an attorney, I represent the district. And what that means is I represent the district as directed by the board of directors, which is the governing entity for the district. So my client is the district, but I take my direction from the board as a whole. And that means I don't work for the district manager. I don't work for the employees of the district. My client is the district, but I take my direction from the board. And so if I'm in doubt about what it is that I'm supposed to do, I go to the board and I get direction from them. And it's not practical for me to take direction from the participating members as a whole. There's just way too many of you, and I couldn't possibly do that. So
understood. Yes.
That's how it works.
And that makes sense to me too. For example, in a political party, we'll say North Dakota Republican Party, in the bylaws, the governing board is the central committee, and then there's the executive board of the central committee. It wouldn't make sense for a lawyer to be responsible to listen to all the different Republicans around the entire state and make, that would keep you running, spinning like crazy. So, it makes sense to, so Susan said, thank you for the clarification, Monty.
You're
So,
welcome.
yeah. So hey, I do appreciate that also. And that makes sense. And that actually leads to, a definite role that the members have is an ultimate, the ultimate remedy is to vote in new members of the board. If the board is not overall performing the way that the members believe, then it's up to the members to replace them. Almost like the Declaration of Independence says, we believe we want to have new, guardians for our liberties or whatever. So anyway, okay. So Susan, thank you. Monty, thank you. Sherry, hopefully you enjoyed this too. And any of you who are also watching this, I'm going to move on to my final slides. Passing here, any other questions? This is my, my phone number, my email. I don't have a website up quite yet. It is really close to being done. But feel free to send me any information or any questions you have. If there is a question that you have coming up that you want me to include in a future episode, shoot me an email, send me a text. I'm going to be doing these, I believe I said the last Tuesday of every month. And I will try to put out a reminder on different websites and social media. And again, I hope to have this posted on YouTube. And, if you want to have a voice, make the right choice. I appreciate the opportunity to share these things because I love parliamentary procedure. I love Robert's rules. I love helping people have the tools that they need to make their voices heard. So hopefully you guys have learned something from this and you have a wonderful night. Thanks so much, you guys. Bye-bye.